All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to explore Chapter 19 of the BNS 2023.
Oh, yeah, this one.
Now, it might sound a bit dry at first. Intimidation, insults, that kind of stuff.
Right.
But trust me, this chapter gets pretty interesting. We're talking about things like threatening someone with divine displeasure.
Really?
Yeah, it's in there. And causing a scene in public, even the whole thing about defamation. It's all about those subtle ways people can harm each other.
It's true. There's a lot more to it than you might think.
And to help us unpack all of this, we've got our expert here. They're going to break it down, explain the nuances, and maybe even give us some real-world examples. The kind that makes you go, hold on, that's actually illegal.
I think we've got some good ones. You might be surprised. It really shows how the law tries to protect us from harm. And not just physical harm, but emotional and reputational harm, too.
Exactly. Okay, let's jump right in. Let's start with something pretty intense.
Yeah.
Criminal intimidation, Section 351. What exactly does that mean?
Well, imagine this. Someone threatens to burn your house down if you don't drop a lawsuit against them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's a pretty classic example of criminal intimidation. It's about using threats to scare you, to force you to do something you're not legally required to do.
So it's not just about the threat itself, it's about the intent behind it.
Exactly. The intent to control someone through fear. And the law takes that very seriously. And depending on how serious the threat is, the punishment changes too. Threatening someone's life obviously has a much harsher penalty than, say, just threatening to spread a rumor.
Right, that makes sense. You don't want to mess around with that stuff. But what about those anonymous threats? The ones where you have no idea who's behind them. Those must be terrifying.
Absolutely. And the law recognizes that added fear. That's why there are even more penalties for people who make anonymous threats.
So there are consequences for those keyboard warriors hiding behind their screens.
Exactly. It's about accountability.
Makes you think twice about sending that angry email, right?
Definitely. Think before you type.
All right, let's move on to something that might feel a bit closer to home for some of us. Insult and provocation. Section 352. This one feels a little tricky to me. We all argue sometimes, right? Where's the line between just a heated argument and something that's actually illegal?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's really what this section is all about. It's not about hurt feelings. It's about deliberately provoking someone, knowing it might lead to a fight or even push them to do something illegal themselves.
So like if you're at a comedy show and you're constantly heckling the comedian, disrupting the whole performance, maybe even starting a fight.
Exactly. It's not just expressing your opinion. It's intentionally trying to cause chaos. The law is trying to prevent things from getting out of control.
You can't just go around yelling insults and expect to get away with it. Context matters a lot.
Absolutely. Context is key. Think about it. Yelling at a basketball game is one thing, but yelling the same things at a tense political rally, that's totally different.
Right. The potential for things to escalate is much higher in that kind of setting.
Exactly. So it's about being aware of the situation and understanding what your words can lead to.
Words have power, and the law knows that.
It does.
Okay, let's move on to something that feels incredibly relevant these days. Spreading false information. Section 353 covers a whole bunch of scenarios where this is a big no-no.
Yeah, this is a big one, especially with the rise of social media and the way information travels now.
Exactly, it's everywhere.
So what kinds of things are we talking about here?
Well, the BNS covers a lot. Things like inciting mutiny in the armed forces, causing public panic, even stirring up hatred between communities based on things like religion or race. Anything that could threaten social harmony and lead to more offenses.
And it specifically mentions electronic means, which feels very 21st century, doesn't it?
It does. The law recognizes how quickly false information can spread online and the harm it can cause.
So sharing a silly rumor about your favorite celebrity, that's one thing. But intentionally spreading lies to incite violence or hatred, that's a whole different story. Right. And there's another interesting thing about this section. If this happens in a place of worship, the penalties are even harsher.
Wow, okay, that's serious.
It is. Think about the potential for damage. Imagine someone spreading a lie about a contaminated water supply in a small town. People could panic, get hurt trying to escape. Businesses could shut down. It could be devastating.
Okay, so we've established that intentionally spreading lies to create chaos is definitely not okay. But hold on, there's one more scenario in this section I'm really curious about. What does it mean to incite one community against another?
Well, imagine someone purposely spreading lies or inflammatory statements about a specific group, like a religious or ethnic group, trying to stir up resentment and hostility towards them. That's what this section is trying to prevent.
So it's about protecting vulnerable groups from becoming targets of hate and discrimination.
Exactly.
Wow.
And think about how easily this can happen online. With the way social media algorithms work, it's a real issue.
It definitely makes you think about the information we consume and share, especially online. Okay, next up is one that really caught my eye. Section 354, divine displeasure. It sounds like something out of a history book.
It does have a bit of an old-fashioned ring to it, right?
Yeah.
But it deals with a form of coercion that still happens today. Basically, this law is about using spiritual beliefs to manipulate someone.
So like threatening someone with a curse if they don't do what you want, or saying they'll be punished by a higher power.
Exactly. It's about forcing someone to act out of fear of those supernatural consequences.
That's a powerful form of manipulation because it taps into people's deepest fears.
Absolutely. And the BNS makes it very clear that this type of manipulation is a crime.
You know, I've even heard of cases where people threaten to harm their own children to make someone believe they'll suffer divine punishment. It's really scary how people can exploit religious beliefs.
It is a disturbing thought. But thankfully, this part of the BNS helps protect people from that kind of abuse.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. What about public intoxication and annoyance? Section 355 tackles this one.
Yeah, this is about being drunk in public and behaving in a way that bothers other people.
Okay, now I'm picturing all sorts of scenarios. Someone blasting loud music late at night, getting a bit rowdy at the park, stumbling around and bothering people on the street.
Right, all of that.
Where exactly is the line between just being a bit tipsy and actually causing annoyance in the eyes of the law?
That's a good question. It depends a lot on the context. What's annoying at midnight in a quiet neighborhood might be totally fine at a street festival during the day. But the key is that the behavior is caused by intoxication, and it genuinely bothers other people.
So it's not about outlawing having a few drinks. It's about preventing situations where being drunk leads to disruptive behavior in public spaces.
Exactly. We all need to be responsible and mindful of how our actions affect those around us.
All right, now let's talk about defamation. Section 356. This is where things get really interesting, I think.
This is a big one. Defamation is all about harming someone's reputation through what you say or write, even through signs or pictures.
And the BNS goes into a lot of detail about this.
Yeah.
I was surprised to learn that you can even defame a deceased person if it harms their living family.
Yeah, that's in there. It shows how much a person's reputation can matter, even after they're gone. And it's not just individuals who can be defamed. Companies and groups can be targeted, too.
Right, that makes sense. But what really struck me was how the BNS defines harm to reputation. It's not just about calling someone a bad name.
Right, it goes deeper than that.
It's about damaging their character, their standing in their profession, even their creditworthiness. It's pretty broad.
It is. It's about anything that causes people to see someone in a negative light. And remember, intent plays a big role here.
Yeah, a subtle jab or a well-placed rumor can be just as damaging as an outright lie.
Absolutely. And the BNS gives lots of examples of how defamation can happen in different ways. A snide remark here, a suggestive photo there, it can all add up to real damage.
So defamation is a serious offense. But I'm guessing there are exceptions, situations where even if you say something damaging, you might not be held responsible.
You're right, there are. The BNS lists 10 exceptions, and they basically provide a legal defense if the statement meets certain criteria. Like, for example, if what you said is true and it's in the public interest to know, that's a valid defense.
So truth is a defense, as long as it serves a greater purpose.
Exactly. It's all about transparency and holding people accountable, especially when it comes to things that affect everyone.
Okay, that makes sense. What about things like book reviews or movie reviews? Critics are always giving their opinions, sometimes pretty harsh ones. Can they be sued for just giving a bad review?
That's where Exception 6 comes in. It allows for fair comment on things like public performances. So, as long as the critic is expressing their honest opinion about the work itself and not making personal attacks or spreading lies, they're protected.
Okay, so critics can breathe a sigh of relief. But where exactly is the line between fair comment and something that's actually defamatory?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, it's one that often ends up being debated in court. It can get pretty complicated, especially when you're dealing with satire, parody, or just strong opinions.
Right, so it's all about context and intent as always.
Exactly.
It seems like finding that balance between protecting people's reputations and allowing for open discussion is tricky.
It is. It's a constant balancing act.
Speaking of balancing acts, I want to go back to what we were talking about earlier with social media changing the whole landscape of defamation. It feels like all the traditional boundaries are being blurred in the digital age. What are your thoughts on that?
It's true. The internet has created a whole new world of communication, and it comes with its own set of challenges. For example, with anonymity, it's much harder to figure out someone's intent.
Right, like, is that sarcastic comment on a blog post meant to be serious? Or is it just a joke?
Exactly. And then there's the speed and reach of online information. Something can go viral in seconds and reach millions of people before anyone can even think about taking it down.
Right, it's like trying to put out a wildfire with a garden hose.
Exactly.
So what can be done about it? Is the law even equipped to deal with this?
That's the million-dollar question. And there's no easy answer. Some people think online platforms should be held responsible for what people post on them, while others think that would be like censorship.
Right, too much control over what people can say can be dangerous too.
It is. It's a really tough issue.
Well, it definitely gives us a lot to think about. But before we dive into the rest of those exceptions and what happens if you actually are found guilty of defamation, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. We're diving right back into our exploration of Chapter 19, looking at those exceptions to defamation.
Yeah, these exceptions are super important. They show how the law tries to balance things, protecting people's reputations, but also allowing for free speech.
Right. It's like a legal tightrope walk.
Yeah.
So can you give us some examples, like real-world situations where those exceptions might come into play?
Absolutely. Okay, so let's say you're a journalist and you're covering a major public health crisis. You write an article criticizing how a government official is handling things. Now, as long as your opinions are based on facts and you're not just trying to be malicious, you'd probably be protected under that exception for commenting on public servants.
So even if that official feels like their reputation has been hurt, the journalist's right to speak out on an important issue outweighs that.
Exactly. It's about the public's right to know and the importance of holding those in power accountable.
Okay, I see. What about the exception for fair comment on public questions? That one seems pretty broad. Can you explain that one a bit more?
Sure. Imagine there's a big debate going on about a new law, right? People on both sides are going to have strong opinions, maybe even get into heated arguments. But as long as the comments are focused on the actual issue, they're truthful, and people aren't just attacking each other personally, those comments are probably protected.
So passionate debate is okay, even encouraged. But personal attacks are where you cross the line.
Exactly. It's about encouraging healthy discussion and disagreement without letting things get toxic.
Makes sense. Okay, what about the exception for publishing what happens in court? That one seems pretty straightforward. Why is that so important?
Transparency. Imagine if we couldn't report on what happens in court. How would we hold the justice system accountable?
Right, we wouldn't even know what was going on. But are there any limitations to that? Can journalists just publish anything they hear, even if it could hurt someone's reputation?
There are limits, of course. The reporting has to be accurate and fair. You can't twist the facts or present a biased view. That kind of sensationalism can have serious consequences.
Okay, so responsible reporting is crucial. Now, what about the exception that allows for opinions on decided cases and how everyone involved behaved? That one sounds like it could get messy.
It can be tricky, for sure. Think about legal experts who analyze big court decisions. They can give their take on the verdict, the judge's decisions, even the lawyer's strategies. But they have to do it honestly, based on what actually happened in the case.
So you can't just throw around accusations without evidence.
Right. There's a difference between thoughtful analysis and just making things up.
Yeah.
The law allows for critique, but it also wants to protect people from baseless attacks.
It's all about finding that balance again. Free speech versus protecting reputations.
Exactly. And it's a balance that's always being tested, especially these days with social media.
Speaking of social media, can we go back to that for a minute? I feel like technology has really blurred the lines when it comes to defamation.
It really has.
Yeah.
The internet has created a whole new set of problems, like how do you determine intent when someone's hiding behind a screen name?
Right. And then there's the whole thing about how fast information spreads online. It's like a runaway train.
It is. Something can go viral in seconds.
Yeah.
And the damage can be huge, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole.
So what's the solution? Can the law even keep up with all of this?
That's the tough question, isn't it? There's no easy answer. Some people think social media platforms should be held responsible for what people post, while others think that's going too far.
Right, it's a tricky situation. It's about finding the right balance between freedom of speech and protecting people from online harm.
Exactly. And it's a conversation that's happening everywhere right now. Governments, tech companies, everyone's trying to figure it out.
Well, it definitely gives us a lot to think about. But let's get back to those exceptions for now. We talked about truth being a defense and fair comment on public figures and issues. What about some of the other exceptions? Like you mentioned one about protecting yourself or the public good. What does that mean exactly?
Okay, so imagine this. You're a business owner, and you discover one of your employees has been stealing from you. You might feel obligated to warn other businesses about that person, even if it means sharing information that could hurt their reputation.
So in that situation, you'd be protected because you're trying to prevent harm to others.
Right. The law recognizes that sometimes sharing information that could be seen as defamatory is actually the right thing to do. But you have to be careful, of course. You need to have solid evidence.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the exception for giving warnings in good faith? How does that work?
Think about it in terms of personal relationships. Let's say your kid's new friend has a history of bullying other kids. You might feel like you need to warn your child, even if it means saying something negative about that friend.
So it's not about gossiping or spreading rumors. It's about genuinely trying to protect someone.
Exactly. The law understands that we have a responsibility to look out for each other, especially those we care about. But again, it all comes down to intent. If you're just trying to spread nasty rumors, you won't be protected.
Okay, so intent is key. It seems to be a recurring theme in all of these exceptions.
It is. And it can be hard to prove in court. Figuring out someone's true motives can be a challenge.
It makes sense.
Hmm.
All right, what about that last exception we haven't talked about yet? The one about reprimands from people in authority.
Oh, that one. It's basically about situations where someone in a position of power has the right to criticize or discipline someone under their authority, like a judge reprimanding a lawyer in court, or a teacher disciplining a student.
And even if those reprimands could hurt someone's reputation, it's still allowed.
Exactly. It's about maintaining order and setting standards of behavior. Think about it. If teachers couldn't discipline students without worrying about being sued for defamation, schools would be chaos.
That's a good point. So it's all about finding that balance again, protecting reputations while also allowing for certain types of speech, even if it's negative.
Right. And as we've been talking about, that balance is constantly being tested, especially in the digital world.
Okay, we've covered those defamation exceptions pretty thoroughly. Ready to move on to something else.
Definitely.
Yeah.
What's next on our legal adventure?
Well, in the first part, we briefly touched on Section 357, which is about breaching a contract to care for someone who's helpless. I think it deserves a closer look. It's a unique offense that really highlights how vulnerable some people are and the responsibility we have to those who depend on us.
I agree. It's a really important topic that brings up some tough questions about ethics and the law.
The BNS is very specific about who this section protects. People who can't take care of themselves because of their age, mental state, illness, or weakness. It's about making sure those who can't advocate for themselves are protected.
Right. Imagine an elderly person who needs help with everyday things like bathing or dressing. They hire a caregiver, and that caregiver just disappears, leaving them in a vulnerable state. That's exactly what this section is trying to prevent.
Or a child with a disability who needs special care, and their parents or guardians just abandon them.
Exactly. This section is all about making sure those who are most vulnerable in our society are cared for and protected from harm.
It's a powerful statement about the responsibility we have to each other, especially those who can't speak for themselves.
Absolutely. And the consequences for violating this section are serious. Imprisonment, fines, or both.
Wow, that's intense. But it's important to remember, this only applies when there's a legal contract in place, right? It's not about criminalizing everyday acts of kindness or helping out a friend or family member who's struggling.
You're right. This section is specifically about formal agreements where someone is legally obligated to provide care. It's about recognizing the serious nature of that responsibility and making sure vulnerable people are protected.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. From defamation and its many exceptions to divine displeasure and breaching contracts to care for the helpless, Chapter 19 has been a wild ride.
It has. It just shows how complex and multifaceted the law can be. It's not always about black and white, right and wrong. It's about understanding context, intent, and finding the right balance between different interests.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, the law is always evolving. trying to keep up with the changes in our society and the new challenges we face.
Right. As technology advances and social norms change, the legal system has to adapt to stay relevant and make sure it's still doing its job, protecting people and upholding justice.
Well, I don't know about you, but my brain is feeling a little overloaded after all of that legal analysis. Ready to wrap things up?
I'm ready. I'm curious to hear your final thoughts on this chapter. What are your takeaways?
You know, it really makes you think about how careful we need to be with our words, doesn't it?
It does. It's like that old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me.
Right, but we all know that's not really true.
Definitely not. Words can have a huge impact. And this whole chapter, it just shows how the law is trying to deal with that.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes me wonder, with everything changing so fast these days, especially with technology and social media, can the law even keep up?
It's a good question. I mean, think about it. Back in the day, if someone wanted to spread rumors about you, it was a much smaller scale. Word of mouth, maybe a letter, something like that.
Right, there's limited.
But now, social media, it's like a global gossip mill. One post, and boom, millions of people see it.
It's like wildfire, and the damage can be immense.
Absolutely. And then there's the anonymity factor.
Yeah.
People hiding behind fake profiles. It makes it that much harder to hold them accountable.
So what can we do? Where do we go from here? How do we protect people from online harm without stifling free speech?
That's the million-dollar question. And I don't think there's an easy answer. Some people say we need stricter rules for online platforms, make them responsible for what people post.
Right. Hold the platforms accountable.
Exactly. But others worry that would give those platforms too much power, like censorship.
It's a tricky situation. You don't want to shut down free speech, but you also don't want people being attacked and harassed online.
Right. It's all about finding that balance. And that's something we as a society need to figure out together.
Well, it's definitely a lot to think about. But you know what? This whole deep dive into Chapter 19, it's been fascinating. I've learned so much about how the law works, how it tries to adapt to the world around us.
You too. It's been a great conversation.
And to our listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this journey as well. We've covered a lot, from defamation and divine displeasure to the importance of protecting those who can't protect themselves. It's all part of this complex and ever-evolving world of law.
And it's something that affects all of us in ways we might not even realize. So stay informed, stay curious, and keep those legal conversations going.
Absolutely. Until next time, folks.